The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder. Tonight I have the privilege of sharing the air in the company of Father Anthony Cekada, Assistant Pastor of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio, and author of the book Work of Human Hands, which is a study of our show this evening. Father, welcome to the program, and thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
So, Father, as stated in our Zero show back in November, this program is going to be a deeper look into your book and how the theological critique, which is justly given in this book, is a direct cause-effect relationship to what all of us have escaped the Novus Ordo and have had to endure. We're going to allow you to expound on each chapter, maybe bring in some of your war stories to liven the discussion, as well as hopefully to provide a starting point for those in our audience who are still in the Novus Ordo religion to see why the theology of the Mass of Paul VI has borne the rotten fruits of what they're having to endure on a week-in, week-out basis at their parish. A significant portion of this show will also be to allow our audience to ask Father specific questions they may have about the differences in the new Mass versus the true Roman Catholic Mass of the ages, to get a better understanding of the origins of this impostor religion, which has been the aim of the modernists to implement since well before the Council. I also want to reiterate what we spoke of when we did our Zero show with Father back in November, that we're not going to be reading this book chapter by chapter. We will be using the chapters as a guideline, but you can read the book, and that's hopefully what we're going to inspire you to do. We're going to leave that to you, the listener, and we encourage you to go to sggresources.org and buy yourself a copy of this book. It really is one of those works that really every Catholic should have on his shelf. But all in all, to our Novus Ordo listeners, this show is for you. If you're just beginning your journey towards finding the traditional Catholic faith, what we call Roman Catholicism, and are scandalized by what you see at your local parish and are confused about how it happened, why it happened, then this show and this book is going to lay it out for you. So, Father, let's go ahead and jump right in with both feet and start discussing chapter 1 of your work, which is entitled Old Mass versus New Mass, What's the Fuss All About? And we'll begin with the doctrinal motives. Now, at this point, we're going to move forward under the assumption that our listener knows the term New Mass refers to the Novus Ordo Missae, or the New Order of Mass, or properly speaking, the 1970 Missale Romanum promulgated by Paul VI. In addition to the book, I'd like the listeners to get a bit of a history lesson, maybe a walk back in time down memory lane with you, Father, specifically to hear the events that you write about firsthand from you, and we'll tie your thoughts into the content of the chapter. Coming from my side of the microphone here, Father, it's always a pleasure to get to hear someone relate to me what the church was like before the Council, because honestly, to imagine the church functioning normally and having the real Catholic faith in a parish down the street, to me, might as well be fiction. I think that illustrates how far gone we are, that in the mind of the Catholic, I can't imagine the church functioning normally. So let's give you the floor, Father, and tell us the story of the new Mass versus the old Mass. And let's start with some terminology for the listeners.
Okay.
Could you explain to listeners what we say when we say the Mass of St. Pius V, or the Tridentine Mass, or the Gregorian Latin Mass? Where did these names for the liturgy originate? And maybe to the person that doesn't know any better, did St. Pius V create a new Mass?
Okay, well, that's a two-part question for us here. Generally, when you speak about the Old Mass, the Mass of Pius V, the Tridentine Mass, what this refers to is the Mass as it was celebrated before the changes of the Second Vatican Council. And the word Tridentine comes from the word for the city of Trent, where the Council of Trent was held in the 16th century. And the Council of Trent decreed a reform of the liturgy in the sense that a suppression of different abuses and that had started to creep in different parts of the church, and in effect legislated greater uniformity for the celebration of Mass in the West. So Tridentine Missal or the Missal of Pius V, because in 1570 it was Pope St. Pius V who promulgated the version of the Mass that the Council of Trent had seen as desirable. So it's also called the Mass of Pius V. The Missal that was used before the Second Vatican Council was all based on this particular liturgical reform of Pius V. There were subsequent changes made to the Missal in the way of additional prayers, additional saints' feasts, some clarifications of the rubrics, etc. That remained, in substance, it remained the same up until about between 1951 and 1955, when there was a series of changes in the Holy Week and in the rubrics of that Missal. But substantially, it was the same thing until just before the Second Vatican Council. So that's a fairly broad spectrum. But when I refer in my book to the traditional Missal, I refer to the 1951 Missal because you have to pick some edition that you're going to use for the sake of comparison. So that's a long answer, but the history of the Mass is a long history.
Certainly is. Okay, you use another term that I think our listeners may need to have clarified. When we say Roman Missal, what do we mean?
Well, that's the Missal that's used in the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church. There are other rites in the Catholic Church, Eastern rites, but the Roman Rite is the one that is particular to Catholics in the West, and they historically have had Mass celebrated all the time in Latin. And they have taken the lead all the time from the way that the Mass was celebrated in Rome.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the Missal of 1951, and you also referenced that in the book, that is the base Missal that you would use as a reference in this work. Why did you choose the 1951 Missal?
Well, in the 1950s, as we'll see, there were a series of changes that were introduced into the calendar, into Holy Week, into certain other ceremonies of the liturgical year. And these ended up being a trial balloon for the changes that would come after the Second Vatican Council. They didn't have as radical an effect, but it was as if the people who were proposing the liturgical changes were testing, putting their toes in the water, as it were.
Okay, all right. So I guess it's something that I want to sort of hear from your perspective, because everybody has their story. How old were you when you first came to know there was going to be a new Mass? Not to the point of where the Mass had been introduced yet, but you knew changes were coming down the pike, and maybe you had to endure a dialogue Mass, and we'll talk more about that later on down the road. But what was the thought process of both you and the average faithful at the time in the pews about a quote unquote new Mass coming down?
Well, I think it kind of depended where you started out. In Catholic grade school, we were very well trained. What the Mass represented, how we were to follow the Mass, how we were to understand the Mass. We were taught in fourth grade how to use a Missal. And it was considered normal that in fourth grade you would learn how to use a Missal. So there was no difficulty understanding what was going on. The parish that I was at, the parish grade school, the children sang a high Mass every day. So we were taught to sing Gregorian chant, all sorts of different Gregorian chants, and we did it very well in different Latin hymns. So we were very much plugged in to what was going on in the liturgy. When I was in fifth grade, that, I think, was the time around which the Second Vatican Council started. I remember we said a prayer every day for the success of the Second Vatican Council. It began, I think, with the words, "O Divine Spirit." I can't remember the rest of it, but it was for the success of this ecumenical council, which was viewed as, a great event in the lifetime of the Church. A few years later, in seventh grade and the beginning of eighth grade, we started to hear about different changes that would come about in the Church, but particularly changes that would come in the Mass. We were told that some parts of the Mass would go into English so people could understand those parts of the Mass better and could participate better. But even as a kid at the beginning of eighth grade, when there was really a lot of talk about this from the sisters, I thought it was very strange because I figured, well, I started out in fourth grade using a missal. I have no problem understanding the Mass. And I sure have no problem singing every day, so I don't see what the problem is. Mm-hmm. So from my perspective at that point, it was, it seemed to me that something unnecessary was going on. And then when it actually happened, it was Advent of 64, and I was an altar boy, and I was in the middle of eighth grade, and I was planning to go to the seminary. I remember serving the first Mass in my parish that was offered with some of the initial changes. There was a man who was a commentator who commented on different parts of the Mass, who read the epistle in English and told people when to sing hymns and when to stand up and when to sit down. And it struck me as very strange that even as a kid, that it took away something from the holiness and the mystery of the Mass that I'd been taught about in Catholic grade school. Now, that was my reaction. Bishop Dolan, who is the same age as me, he had the same reaction. He was in Detroit and thinking of going to the minor seminary. And Bishop Sanborn was in the freshman year of, I think it was Cathedral High School in New York, and he had the same reaction, that there's something strange or different or insufficiently respectful about it. A lot of people did. I was just talking with a lady today who had taken an interest in the traditional Mass. She's my age, and she had the same reaction. So that's kind of what that was kind of the mentality going into the changes, and I imagine there are many other people like that. And
I'm sorry, Father.
No. Well, as the years rolled along, things got worse.
I remember speaking with my father about this, who also grew up in the traditional rite, years ago, long before the council, and he said, he recalled the nuns telling him that, the Mass can never change, the Mass can never change, the Mass will never change, and then one day the Mass changed, and he said, and so we had no problem understanding the Mass. It was very clear what was going on. So to act as if we needed someone to explain it to us, to show us really how to worship in the Mass, was a real shock. So let me ask you this, Father. How old were you when you first saw the new Mass, when it was officially introduced? What was your age, and what was your first impression of seeing this new Mass?
Well, see what happened. Here's what happened, Justin. You had, so in '64 there was the first series of transitional changes for the Mass, and certain things went into the vernacular. Then successively there were other changes that were added. More of it went into the vernacular, and in I think '67 67 or 68, the whole Mass went into English, went into the vernacular. So more and more of the elements of the Old Mass were taken away. And then finally, in 69, Paul VI promulgated, that is to say, presented as a law the new Mass in March of 69. And then in 1970 was when we first saw it in the vernacular. So it kind of went over a series of years. Now, my reaction, so I was actually a freshman in college when the new Mass came in the vernacular in the United States. But during that period of time from, say, 64 onward, I was in the minor seminary and remember, in fact, having fights already, even as a kid, with the different liberals that we had on the faculty in the seminary about, doctrinal questions and moral questions and certainly the liturgy. You would hear an awful lot about liturgical abuses, that people would treat the Mass in a very disrespectful way. You'd have all sorts of terrible music, which I found very repellent. They would have communion in the hand, even when it was not permitted. The priest would improvise different prayers. You'd have handshaking for the sign of peace. And we were told that the Pope was going to take care of that by putting out this new Mass in 1969. So by that point, my Latin was fairly decent. So when I first heard it was available in Latin, I drove across town to get a copy of it. And remember reading through it, and I was really appalled because it had sort of institutionalized a lot of the things that I had found offensive about the new changes. So that was my reaction to it. And then instead of the Pope solving the problem, he institutionalized the problem.
Was your reaction similar to the Catholic faithful that you were going to church with at the time, or were they very accepting of these new changes? Did they find it rather alien, or were they willing to accept it and say, well, we can deal with this, or, we'll give it some time and see how it goes?
Well, it was the reaction, I would say, was all over the place. Some people were, especially converts from Protestantism, were revolted by the changes because you would get reactions from people like that who would say that, I didn't convert to Catholicism to become a Protestant again, with this new way of worship. So there's reaction against it on the part of some people. Others went along with it, I would say, unprotestingly, even though they felt a little upset. They figured, well, it's something that's coming from the church. There are the other group, another faction of people thought it didn't go far enough, that you should have even crazier things. And, many members of the clergy believe that as well. But there was a reaction against it. In the beginning, there was in the United States a priest named Father Gomar de Paul. He initially, I remember, when the initial changes came into the Tridentine Mass, where different parts started to be taken away in maybe 65 or 66, I remember seeing him on television denouncing the liturgical changes and the awful translations and saying that it was positively terrible. So you did have, and a number of people felt the same way, and you saw kind of the beginnings of a traditionalist movement at that point.
I also think about certainly most important reference quote here from Cardinal Ottaviani, who wrote to Paul VI in 69. If you'll allow me to quote this real quick for our listeners, Cardinal Ottaviani was the Secretary of the Holy Office, who, by the way, for those who aren't aware, is the chief doctrinal guardian of the faith of the Roman Catholic Church. And he wrote The accompanying critical study of the Novus Ordo Missae, the work of a group of theologians, liturgists, and pastors of souls, shows quite clearly, in spite of its brevity, that if we consider the innovations implied or taken for granted, which may of course be evaluated in different ways, the Novus Ordo represents, both as a whole and in its details, a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in session 22 of the Council of Trent. Now, that's a pretty stark reaction, I would say, particularly coming from someone like Cardinal Ottaviani.
I actually remember reading that. There was a conservative Catholic magazine in the United States that was called Triumph. It had many very good articles in it, that discussed the different abuses, et cetera. And this was in the 60s, the late 60s it started. I remember, I of course subscribed to it, and I remember reading its translation of the Ottaviani intervention and saying, wow, this document really nailed what the problems are with this Mass of Paul VI. And, it was very encouraging that you had someone like Ottaviani who, in effect, endorsed the ideas, so that there was something wrong with it. And those of us who, at that point, were very suspicious of the Vatican II changes and very much opposed to the different abuses were going on. We took a lot of consolation at that. And there was still a coterie of us in the seminary who, had difficulties with these changes. And the fact that you had someone like Ottaviani backing up these criticisms of the new Mass was very, very powerful.
I would imagine that it was. So generally speaking, as we in America would say, that the negative reception of the Novus Ordo began right from the get-go.
Yes, there was a reaction, and eventually it became stronger as a result of the Ottaviani intervention. That is, in effect, the charter of the traditionalist movement that really got the resistance galvanized quite a bit. And
so when did this,
once.
I'm sorry, Father, go ahead. No, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't interrupt you.
No, this really gave the traditionalist movement, as it were, an impetus, and it really got things going, and it gathered steam from there.
So with this traditionalist, what we might call the counter-revolution, did this emerge almost instantly? I mean, was this something that happened almost right off the bat?
Well, as I say, in 64, 65, there were people who objected, and it was to the liturgical changes. It was a small group, and eventually it gathered steam.
Okay.
But you were still, at least in the United States, regarded as very much of a crank if you objected to the liturgical changes.
Yes.
So many people just simply left, became discouraged and left. Other people went from church to church, reacting to one bad incident in say their home parish, going somewhere else, and then encountering some other abuse, and then walking out of that. Now, one hears many stories like that. But that was the nature of this liturgical change.
Okay, Father, let's go ahead and move into the 1970s now. In your book, you mention the name Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. Now, some of our listeners, I would assume many of our listeners are going to obviously know who this is, but Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre was the founder of the Society of St. Pius X. That he was an apostolic delegate to French-speaking Africa. He was a superior general of the Holy Ghost Fathers, and that was all under Pope Pius XII. Now, you mentioned the declaration that Archbishop Lefebvre made in 1971. And he made a comment that the Mass of Paul VI was Protestant, modernist, potentially invalid, and many other very, very damning accusations. Now, had anyone spoken like this up to this point to 1971, or was this the first time really that the egg was cracked? And what was the global reaction to Archbishop Lefebvre's statement?
Well, I mean, you had priests who said this before, and in the United States. I mentioned already this Father Gomar Dupas, and there were others in the United States. Lefebvre was the highest ranking Catholic cleric to say something like this. But his declaration, at least in the United States, didn't receive that much publicity. It's hard for us to imagine in the internet age how difficult it was to get news and to find out what was going on in other parts of the world. I only heard of Archbishop Lefebvre's 71 speech when actually I went to Europe myself and went to a seminary several years later. So it had, I'm sure, it had an effect in Europe, but because the sources of publicity in those days were rather tightly controlled, it didn't make as big a splash as a declaration like that would have made later after he became a more prominent public figure.
Sure. For those of you who
but it certainly had an effect. As the trad movement, the traditionalist movement in France, certainly had, since France is smaller, and it had a very strong religious political right wing. The declarations of Archbishop Lefebvre were promoted by other traditionalist priests in France and were quite widely circulated there. So it had quite an effect there.
For those of you who are just joining us, it's the bottom of the hour here, 7:30 Eastern Time, and you're listening to The Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm joined by Father Anthony Cekada, and today we are speaking of his book, Work of Human Hands. We're starting with Chapter 1, and we're going to work into Chapter 2. So far, we've been covering sort of the origins of the traditional movement in reaction to the Vatican II changes and the introduction of the Mass of Paul VI. We'd like to remind you that Work of Human Hands is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. If you'd like to use our work, you can contact us at mail@truerestoration.org. So, Father, what was... Okay, so Archbishop Lefebvre was the first, or as you said, the highest-ranking prelate that would have made such a statement of this. What was the Vatican reaction to Archbishop Lefebvre's statement?
Again, because it was so hard to get information out, it was so hard to get the word out and to publicize things, but using the old technology of paper. That seems so strange to say it now, but there was initially not much of a reaction, but as the movement gained momentum in Europe, eventually the Vatican had to react. Now, there was some rumbling because of the Ottaviani intervention. Paul VI, in fact, mentioned a number of, or tried to gloss over a number of problems with the new Mass in a speech in November of 1969, in two audiences, actually. So you had that was pre-Lefebvre, but as the movement gained ground, those who wanted the old Mass tried to claim that it was still permissible to have the new Mass without violating the will of Paul VI, and they tried to, make that particular argument, and to even some of them to acquire Vatican approval for retaining the old Mass. Well, the answer was, with the exception of old priests who were incapable, basically, of accommodating themselves to the new rite, Rome insisted very much that the new Mass was the law, and issued several declarations to that effect. And so that galvanized traditionalist reaction as well. And parallel with that, Archbishop Lefebvre's work with the Society of St. Pius X and his foundation of that and formation of priests, then that also gave more prominence to the question of the Mass. So throughout the 1970s, it became, quite hot topic in Europe, at least. There were declarations and condemnations issued back and forth between Lefebvre and Paul VI.
Okay. I forgot to mention, Father, that if our listeners would like to call into the show tonight to speak with Father, you're welcome to. Our phone number is 949-272-9417. Again, it's 949-272-9417. Father, I just want to kind of maybe bracket this reflection of the early traditionalist resistance. We were in the 1970s, and I've kind of bracketed this period, as you have in the book, from 1970 to 84. So what was going on in the traditionalist resistance camps from 70 to 84? And we'll get to why 84 was a very important point or a very important time in just a moment. But so would you say from the 70s to the 80s, it was primarily the work of Archbishop Lefebvre, who was certainly the worldwide face of this resistance, or were there other groups that were also doing this? I mean, I think about names like Dietrich von Hildebrand, I think about Michael Davies, I think about Dr. William Mara, certain groups like the Roman Forum, which started popping up, which were obviously very, very outspoken. What really was the traditional battle against the Mass and Vatican II from, say, we'll just give it 1972 to 1984?
Well, it wasn't just Archbishop Lefebvre. There were many priests, many older priests throughout the world who were diocesan priests or members of religious orders, and they set up Mass centers where they celebrated the Old Mass. And there are a good number of those in the United States, or they would say Mass, in a circuit, go from city to city to say Mass. They would preach against the new Mass and against the Vatican II changes. There were a number of newspapers and little periodicals founded in the traditionalist movement that were circulated among those resisting Vatican II. So it was very diffuse throughout the world. Even though Lefebvre was the most prominent, this was going on without him a little bit everywhere. So you had that going on from 72 onwards. You had the hot summer of 76 and 77 where Lefebvre got a lot of publicity. And I was ordained in 77, and my ordination was, covered by CBS News, and I gave an interview to them, and there was a big stink in the press in the United States and everywhere over it. Denunciations from the Archbishop of Milwaukee when I said public Mass there back in my hometown. So it picked up steam. In 79 or 78, JP2 was elected, and it was at that point that Archbishop Lefebvre sort of pulled his horns in, as it were, a little bit in terms of more open resistance, and he got started the path of negotiation again with the Vatican. In 1964, what happened is that the Vatican issued what was called the 1984 Indult for the traditional Mass. This document allowed groups or allowed dioceses to authorize the celebration with the permission of the bishop of a Mass in the old form, in the old rite. And the people who assisted at that Mass were supposed to declare that they didn't question the legitimacy or the validity of the new Mass. So at 64, it was a turning point in terms of recognition from the Vatican. Before that, it was always drop dead. there was no way you were going to get permission, because the Mass of Paul VI was considered the Mass of the Roman Rite, period. And it was considered unassailable, and you were blown off if you asked for permission otherwise. But in 84, that changed. So there's a change of line, as it were, with the introduction of these masses called an indult mass. The reason it's called indult is an indult is a legal decree that allows an exception to a general law. So the idea was that, the general law is the Mass of Paul VI, and we're going to give you special permission under certain circumstances not to observe that and to have the old Mass.
Okay, Father. Well, let's take just a small little detour here and talk about something that I'm certain that anyone who's been in the traditionalist world for any period of time has certainly heard this Latin phrase, and maybe those who are new have never heard it. But I think this is going to be important to define this, because we're going to begin to move into your doctrinal motives and the doctrinal positions in Chapter 1 here. Can you give us a working definition of that Latin phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, and why is it important for Catholics to understand this principle when trying to understand the traditionalist position to the rejection of the new Mass?
Well, the Latin phrase, the law of praying, is the law of believing. That's one of the renditions of it. The idea of it is that there's an intimate relationship between prayer and belief. That certainly, say, the public prayers of the Church are based on the creeds and on the beliefs of the Church. However, it is also true to say that the manner in which one prays, the lex orandi, the manner of prayer, also affects people's beliefs. So, for instance, if you have a liturgical change, it will affect the way people believe, and the Protestants recognized this when they changed the mode of worship during the so-called Reformation. It was to convey a new faith. So, for instance, you had communion in the hand, whereas before it was delivered in the tongue. And the Reformers said explicitly this was to obliterate the idea of transubstantiation, of the real presence of Christ, of worship of the Blessed Sacrament, and of the sacramental, the special nature of the priesthood, the anointing of his hands, and so on. So that was given as an example, or that's an example of how changing the law of prayer can also affect the law of believing. And that's, what was done. And you had countries, for instance, like England, where Catholics were in effect turned into Protestant simple people by the changes in worship. And it had a profound effect on their view of what they're supposed to believe. So that's lex orandi, lex credendi. There's an interrelationship.
Okay, so circling back around and getting back on the 84 indult road here, did it change anything in terms of availability of the old Mass? I mean, I'll save part 2 of the question after you answer that. Did it change anything in terms of availability?
Well, it depended from diocese to diocese. Some bishops were more liberal, as it were, in allowing it. Generally, they were the bishops who were not would not have been counted as liberals, I suppose, because liberals generally tend to be the least liberal of people when you go against their line. So, but it gave it publicity and it gave it exposure. So you had in different dioceses people who were afraid to perhaps go to a wildcat traditionalist chapel operated by Father Cekada when they read that the Archdiocese of Milwaukee was allowing you to go to a traditionalist Mass, an old Latin Mass at the seminary. This aroused their curiosity, and many people went. initially as a result, and it gave it visibility.
Okay. And I guess part two of this question is going to be, I've gone back and I've read the text of that, issued by John Paul II, and I think this sort of set the foundation, in my view, for how the Vatican wanted traditionalists to form their minds around the issue of the Old Mass, and it talked a lot about preferences and respecting one's sensitivities and things like that. That's the first time that I had heard, or the first time that I had read that type of language in the Indult, was that it began to frame everything to do with the Old Mass around a mere preference. And that this answer was good enough to solve the traditionalist problem. Was it good enough to solve the traditionalist problem?
Well, I mean, it sure didn't.
No, it didn't.
Now they realized the people in the Vatican realized that as it were, the doctrinal power of the Old Mass. In fact, I don't know if it was Monsignor Benelli, who was the Secretary of State. I think he even told Lefebvre that the Old Mass represents an old ecclesiology, an old theology of the Church, and the New Mass represents a new ecclesiology. So they knew, those in charge of the Vatican knew very well the principle of lex orandi and lex credendi. The problem is, how do you authorize the traditional Mass if it represents a different theology? And the way that they did it is by making it purely a matter of preference, trying to say that it's simple, that you have to accept. And they said that specifically in the document in 84, the doctrinal rectitude and of the new Mass, that there was nothing wrong with it, and that on one side. On the other side, they sought to reduce it simply to aesthetics or to a preference sentiment, and tried to sort of defang the problem of the new worship that way, because they knew very well that the hardline traditionalists regarded the Mass as a threat to the Catholic faith. You had Lefebvre saying that. You had countless other traditionalist priests throughout the world saying that as well, that it's modernist or it's Protestant. It's the Mass of Luther, and it represents a different doctrine. So the Vatican wanted to make things nice and vague and blurry, and just reduce it to options and preference, that you like this stuff, so you can have it.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, while we have a traditionalist resistance, which is beginning to gain more and more steam, we also have a Novus Ordo structure where the Novus Ordo Mass is getting more and more and more crazy as the years go along. I mean, I'm a product of the 1980s, and I can tell you for sure, and not to get into too many of my own war stories, but certainly I was, subject to being able to sit through the pleasure of magic act masses around the table, and all these other horrible things. But I think so. There were two diverging paths. Now, let me get a little bit into, and I don't want to spend a whole lot on this because I think it's certainly a point of reference, but we've done other shows on this, and I don't want to get sidetracked. But so we moved past the 84 indult. The next major act that I would say was, and correct me if I'm wrong, was the 88 consecration of the four bishops of the Society of St. Pius X by Archbishop Lefebvre. Now, how did that change the traditionalist resistance at that time? What was the reaction from that, and what was did the Vatican come down hard on the traditionalist movement after that? I mean, certainly you had the 88 indult, which is what I want to get to, and which is kind of an extension of the 84. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, what happened is there was actually an internal division in the Society of St. Pius X over whether or not Lefebvre should consecrate bishops. So there were those in the Pius X Society who were absolutely opposed to this because they thought, oh, well, it's the Holy Father. You can't go against the Holy Father. We do believe he is the true Pope. We have to recognize his legitimacy and so on. So the 88 Lefebvre went, after going back and forth over the issue, and as he tended to do, he went ahead and he consecrated the bishop. So the Vatican then decided that they would try to get into their particular fold the trads in the Society of St. Pius X circles, either priests or laymen who disagreed with Archbishop Lefebvre's decision. So they, to do that, they figured out a way to set up a legal structure for priests who wanted to be part of the Vatican II establishment, let's say the Old Mass. So the result of this was the Fraternity of St. Peter. This was founded by a group of former priests of the Society of St. Pius X, including a classmate of mine, Father Joseph Bisik. And he was the first superior general of the Fraternity of St. Peter. They put together proposed statutes, and they received approval for their organization. And their particular apostolate, I guess, was supposed to be to carry on the traditional Mass.
Okay.
Under the aegis of the post-conciliar church. And there were a number of other groups like that that came out of the 88 consecrations, people who did not want to go along with what Archbishop Lefebvre did. So they were accommodated.
Okay, so now kind of moving into more of the book and speaking about the Mass itself, you quote Archbishop Fernando Antonelli when he made a statement, and I believe this was in '69, about what the Mass is, and that you quoted him with the statement that every word and gesture in the liturgy conveys a theological idea. Now, this certainly is, I would say, this is a foundational argument of the traditionalist movement. Why is it so critical for Catholics to realize what that means when comparing the new with the old? I mean, what would you say is a real take-home keystone point in that statement to those who may be trapped in the Novus Ordo, scandalized by what they see, and understand that what they're watching is conveying words and gestures, or actually, excuse me, the words and gestures that they're observing convey a theological idea?
Well, that in itself is the heart of the issue, the heart of the problem with the new Mass, that it conveys a different theology, a different understanding of the Mass, a different doctrine on so many other points than the traditional Mass does. So there's a divide, there's a real difference between the what we would call the traditional Mass and the new Mass, even the new Mass celebrated in Latin. Now, I assisted at that, celebrated in Latin every day for 2 years with all sorts of Gregorian chant, but there is a theological difference. What the post-Vatican II Church would like one to do is to reduce the differences to mere preference and aesthetics or sentimentality. That you like fancy ceremonies, you are attached to an old form of spirituality, allowing you to have it's just part of diversity, and we all really should get along. There's no theological difference, but that's false. That's a false impression. It reduces the Mass to the difference to simple exercise and nostalgia, where there's a real theological difference. And the interesting thing is that I had a discussion a number of years ago. Some priests from the Fraternity of St. Peter came through town with one of whom I knew, and then some of their seminarians, and we had a discussion about this. I really couldn't get out of them why in the world it was so important to say the old or the Tridentine Mass rather than the new Mass. All they would say is, well, it's our charism, it's our kind of way of doing things. But, I think under the surface is the idea that there's a realization that there is a theological difference. It's just that they don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
And that the new Mass is harmful.
Sure. And I think there's another statement that you make in chapter 1 is you say when you say that you have, let's just say for a second that your preference matters, but when you're saying that you have a preference for the old Mass, what you're also saying in that statement is that the new Mass doesn't provide the preferences, that it doesn't provide what the old Mass did, that there's a clear deviation from the old Mass. And that point kind of hit home with me. I never really looked at it in that sense, but there's also there's that catch, there's that trap that should make people think when they say, oh, well, I like the old Mass better.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's something missing, and that's the point. That indeed there's not just something, but there's a lot of stuff missing, and as a result, there are a lot of bad effects.
Sure. So I think the next milestone here would be the election of Joseph Ratzinger, Father Ratzinger, who in 2005, after John Paul II died. And we had the election, and of course there was kind of a little bit of shockwaves down the corridors of power in Rome, thinking that he was going to be this very staunch conservative candidate who was going to take us all back to the pre-Vatican II days, and on and on and on. And so in 2007, he issued a motu proprio called Summorum Pontificum. Now, this supposedly, quote unquote, freed the old Mass, where it could be said anytime, anywhere, by any priest without permission of the local bishop. And so my first question, which comes from this point, is: was the 2007 motu proprio a logical outgrowth of the 84 indult?
Well, in terms of logic, I mean, certain things defy logic. But I would give this perspective on that as a result of the greater visibility of the old Mass due to the indult, and then to these groups such as the Fraternity of St. Peter, there arose among the younger clergy, sort of the new generation of clergy, an interest in traditional liturgy and initial circles of the new Mass. And this was something that was very interesting. You would have never heard that sort of criticism from mainline clergy in the 1970s. That's absolutely for sure. But by the mid and late 90s, you started to hear that, and Ratzinger was leading the cheering section for that on the basis of the idea of preference and liking nice things in the past. He's a very refined guy, unlike his predecessor and unlike his successor. And he appreciated fine things, and he, was pained when things were ugly at Mass. So in any event, he finally, after his election with the Summorum Pontificum, he was able to put some of his ideas and preferences into practice. And this has been bubbling for a while. And so I guess you could say that it did sort of start in 84.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that the 2007 motu proprio was a distraction rather than a solution?
Well, I mean, in what sense do you mean that? The distraction from the big issue?
Yes, correct. The distraction from the doctrinal problems rather than the aesthetical ones. Because there's statement after statement, consistently all the way from '84 onward, from different officials in the Vatican, from JP2, and also actually from Ratzinger himself, and in Summorum Pontificum, in both the letter to the bishops and in the motu proprio itself, that make it clear that all this is aesthetics, and it's all just a question of preference. So they kept on hammering that idea that it's just a question of preference, that that's their message. So when you frame it in those terms, you cut it off from the idea of theological foundation. And if something is preference, you can have your preference, I can have my preference, and all of this is supposed to be tolerable. So they try to blur, as it were, blur the problem as much as they can. So they were very consistent on that line, that it simply is a question of preference. Father, you did a sermon, or you gave a sermon a while back, and we linked to it in our restorationradionetwork.com show notes, and it was a sermon that was entitled "The Motu Mass: Benefits and Dangers." And I'm linking this to the question of has there been any good which has come from the 2007 motu proprio? And I found something interesting in that sermon where you said that it will hasten the destruction of the Novus Ordo Mass and the Novus Ordo Church. Can you explain that?
Well, because in a real way, it puts before your eyes the differences between the old and the new. And it's very strange. It's one thing to read about the traditional Mass vis-a-vis the new Mass in a book, and it's another thing actually to see them. I was talking with a fella today who's been agonizing over these questions, over these different issues, and he has a grandson who thought he might be interested in the priesthood and going to the seminary, and so he went with Grandpa to an indult Mass that was celebrated in some diocesan church, and he was bowled over by it. Because he mentally compared it to the Novus Ordo. So it's had that effect that people see that there are problems with it. There are real problems with the Novus Ordo, and as the years go on, it becomes more and more indefensible if you're truly concerned about the truths of the Catholic faith. And if you're not in denial, as they would say, about the bad effects of Vatican II and the bad effects of the Novus Ordo.
There's another thing. There's another point that you had made in chapter 1, where you were saying that there are really incredible parallels between Anglican High Churchism and the motu proprio groups today. And by that we would mean those that go to the diocesan Latin Mass, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King. Really the aim of Ratzinger was to try to have kind of a high church and a low church. If you wanted if you wanted frog masses and clown masses, you could go to the Novus Ordo. And if you wanted your nice smells and bells and pretty trappings and frippery, well, we're going to give you the Latin Mass as well. So how is High Church Anglicanism and the motu proprio groups today, how are they strikingly alike?
Well, first of all, we'd have to kind of explain things for people who aren't familiar with the term, I guess, High Church.
Sure.
In the Church of England, or the Episcopal Church, there are fundamentally three different strains of worship and belief and of ideology, and they overlap, but they're all part of the same organization. One would be what is called the Low Church. These are the people who believe in more Protestant, evangelical type ceremonies. They don't go in much for elaborate symbolism and worship. They're against, the referring to their service as the Mass. So you had that group. And then you had the High Church, and the High Church wing of the Anglican started around the 1840s with what was called the Oxford movement. Many of the lights of the Oxford movement actually ended up as Catholics, but the idea was that, we were going to dress up the Anglican rites, the Anglican communion service, and the Anglican Vespers, in effect, evensong, with Catholic externals, different Catholic externals. So that is referred to as the High Church movement because they had a lot of ceremonial. And there's a group in the middle that was called the Broad Church. These were people who could take a little bit of either. Now, the interesting thing is that you had these three different strains in the Anglican Church, who had these different forms of worship. They were part of the same organization. They recognized each other as legitimate, but there was no central body of doctrine to which they actually were required to subscribe. So it became sort of doctrine-free worship, as it were. And you had many eventually in the High Church movement, the Anglicans, people who loved these fancy ceremonials so much that they actually adopted practices from the Catholic Mass for High Mass and all sorts of Catholic ritual. But at the same time, it was there was no real doctrinal meat behind it. That you could believe very little or nothing and conduct these very fancy, these elaborate services. So there's this bifurcation between doctrine and worship. It didn't really matter ultimately what you believed, but you had a preference for fancier worship. So that's a High Church movement. Now, if we take that back and apply it to this particular situation, the approved motu proprio masses that are said within the context of the new church, what you have is, in effect, you have a High Church movement. You have people very much who are repelled by the new way of worship. They don't like the more Protestant form of worship that the new Mass represents, and they want to have something that is somehow connected with the past, that represents Catholic tradition and aesthetics and so on. And so they adhere to the form of the traditional Latin Mass that's done under the aegis of the diocese. And they kind of don't look beyond that at the larger doctrinal picture. Many of them, okay? You'll have some, perhaps a number of people, good number of people, who will go to one of these approved masses saying that, well, they really can't stand the new Mass at all, and they don't approve of what's going on in the Vatican II Church, and they just look upon this as refuge. So you have that too. But it's all at the base of it, there's no doctrinal resistance really to the errors of the modern church. The doctrine is left out.
Right. Living in the South, driving by many Protestant churches around here, this whole idea of high church versus low church, it's such a common thread. You'll see on marquees, traditional service 7 a.m., contemporary service 10:30 a.m. And this seems to kind of be Ratzinger's model. For those of you just joining us, it's just after the top of the hour, 8 o'clock here Eastern Time. You're listening to the Work of Human Hands on Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, Justin Soder, and I'm joined this evening by Father Anthony Cekada, who is discussing Chapter 1 of his book, Work of Human Hands. And we're about to close out Chapter 1, and I want to give Father this last point here is really the meat of the matter in Chapter 1, which we've been trying to discuss when we talk about the high church versus low church argument, is the emphasis in Chapter 1 is that we must understand that the question of the Mass is not about preference but doctrine. So, Father, I'll let you close out Chapter 1, and we'll move on to Chapter 2 with your final thoughts on preference versus doctrine.
Well, that for me has always been the issue, and that was the issue from the beginning with in the so-called traditionalist movement, that the law of praying is the law of believing, and the effect of the new Mass is that it affects what Catholics believe. It harms the Catholic faith and has harmed the Catholic faith in the souls of so many as regards the question of the real presence of Christ, the question of who actually offers the Mass, what takes place at Mass as a real and a true propitiatory sacrifice offered for sins. And the new Mass affects in a deleterious way all of those beliefs. So the heart of the difference, the reason for the battle for the traditional Mass and the battle for the destruction of the new Mass, and it deserves to be destroyed, is the question of Catholic doctrine and also the question of fundamental reverence in the way of worship.
Okay. This is a good time to move on to Chapter 2. We'd like to remind listeners if they want to call in to speak with Father, you can call at 949-272-9417. We'd like to ask you to please keep your questions on topic for the things we're discussing here this evening. If you have any questions that we can take off there, you can feel free to mail us at humanhands@truerestoration.org, and we'll be sure to get your question on to Father. All right, so Father, moving on to Chapter 2, which is entitled The Change Agents. You're reading this chapter, it almost reads like the report of a murder case. I mean, you lay out the names, the places, the times, the beliefs. It's really a foundational chapter for the reader to get an understanding of who the players behind the scenes were. You lay out the root of the liturgical revolution, which operated under the title of the liturgical movement. Of course, the movement started off with noble intentions and, of course, was later on hijacked. So I'd like for you to briefly discuss in broad terms, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this because obviously we want the reader or the listener to read the book. What exactly the liturgical movement was as it was envisaged by Dom Guéranger, and what it became in the middle of the 20th century? How did it get hijacked?
Okay, and we should explain that Dom Guéranger was a French priest who refounded the Benedictine order in France, which had been suppressed during the Revolution. And he saw it as very important to restore the Catholic liturgy. Because of the wars and revolutions in Europe, the practice of the correct performance and the correct understanding of the Catholic liturgy had really gone downhill. So it was his idea to achieve a restoration of the Catholic liturgy. So that's essentially it. The liturgical movement, you could say, was a movement among Catholics, clergy and lay, for the restoration of the Catholic liturgy in all its fullness. And it had very good and very noble beginnings in Dom Guéranger. It really received an impetus from Pope St. Pius X, who was very concerned about liturgical issues, liturgical questions. He reformed the calendar, the breviary. He cultivated Catholic church music. He commissioned the redoing, as it were, of new editions of Gregorian chant, so that it bore really tremendous fruit at this point. Unfortunately, at the same time, toward the beginning of the 20th century, you saw the rise of modernism, which we've discussed in other shows, which was a movement based in modern philosophy and modern thought, essentially atheistic modern philosophy and atheistic modern thought. And the idea of modernism in religion was to make an accommodation with of religion, specifically the Catholic faith, with the ideas of modern society and modern philosophy. And this, as a theological movement, was condemned by Pope St. Pius X in Pascendi. And he uncovered, as it were, the roots of the modernist errors. So at this point, we get we begin to see in the history of the liturgy that those who held suspect ideas on theological questions, that a number of them went into the field of sacred liturgy. And here's where the problems start to begin.
Right. So then we move on to about 1947, whenever Pope Pius XII had to step in, and he issued two keynote encyclicals, Mediator Dei and Mystici Corporis, and to clearly state and definitively reaffirm Catholic doctrine on the nature of the Church and sacred liturgy. Now, my question is, why did Pius XII have to step in and issue these two encyclicals? I mean, certainly he saw something. What was the reasoning for this?
Well, because of the infiltration, as it were, of the modernists into the liturgical movement, there was a wing of the liturgical movement that proposed not only changes in the manner of the celebration of the sacred liturgy, but also proposed different theological ideas about the nature of the church. Pius XII received actually a warning on this from the Bishop of Regensburg in Bavaria, Bishop Grober, and I think it was about 1941, and he sent a memorandum to Pius XII, and I remember when I first saw this, I was really bowled over because what he was complaining about, what Bishop Grober in effect was complaining about was the same sort of false ideas that had come to take over the liturgy and certain areas of theology after Vatican II. And it was really striking to see something like this, 20 years before Vatican II happened. So Pius XII received this warning, this memorandum from Grober, and he eventually produced two encyclicals. One was on the nature of the Church, Mystici Corporis. This was in response to some of the theological errors that people in the liturgical movement were spreading about the nature of the Church. So that was one, in effect, origin for that document was, in fact, the errors of the liturgical movement. And secondly, Mediator Dei, which is this great encyclical on the sacred liturgy, and it's probably the longest document ever to come out of the Vatican, where he lays out all the general principles of the Catholic liturgy and the sacrificial nature of the Mass, the relationship between doctrine and liturgy. He condemns different abuses, so he lays everything out in Mediator Dei. What he tried to do, what the historians say he tried to do, was to say that, okay, there was a lot of good in the liturgical movement, and now I'm going to take that under my thumb, or I'm going to take that in hand, and we're going to sort of take it upstairs and keep an eye on it from Rome. Okay? So that, I think, was basically his idea. There still were good strains in the liturgical movement at that point, and so he was trying to get it under proper authority and regulate
it. This is a question that has always kind of puzzled me, and I'd like your opinion on this, and then I'll follow it up with something else here that directly relates to it. Never understood why Pius XII, who obviously knew that many of these men were up to no good, I mean, as evidenced by his issuance of the aforementioned encyclicals, why did he stop there and not begin removing them compared to, say, a St. Pius X, who would have certainly removed them, probably defrocked them and cast them away? Why was Pius XII seemingly very soft on these individuals? I mean, he had to know, issuing those two encyclicals, why he was issuing them. So why did he leave these men in power?
Well, that's a good question. Is it a question of a character insufficiently strong resolution to be tough with the people who were really and truly the partisans of error? I think it was his perhaps his personality. He was on the theoretical level. I mean, he certainly laid out all the principles, but he didn't really have the guts to carry all of them through. He knew, for instance, that Montini was a bad guy, and that Montini was a modern sympathizer, but instead of taking a definitive action with Montini and, making him like an Italian army chaplain or something like that, he made him Archbishop of Milan. And so it's extremely mysterious. He didn't have the forceful type of personality and resolution to really crack heads.
I think it's just a small note for our listeners. When Father says Montini, he is speaking of Giovanni Montini, who was the Archbishop of Milan, which began in 54, but he also was later Paul VI. So I think that's just a quick little reference there. Father, do you think traditional Catholics sort of romanticize the pontificate of Pius XII to an unbalanced degree? I mean, are they objectively fair when evaluating his pontificate?
Well, I mean, it's those of us who remember it, remember the things where the church was a flourishing institution then. It was a respected institution. I always talk about the, as a kid going to the minor seminary for the first day and looking up the driveway of the major seminary next door and seeing, 250 guys in cassocks out for their morning walk. So these were flourishing institutions. And, of course, there is that romance that surrounds Pius the 12th. But, you have to be realistic in the sense that, unfortunately, he let a lot of things go. And the things that he did, a number of things that he did were actually quite ineffectual.
Mm-hmm. There was an interview done with Bishop Sanborn and Stephen Heiner called The Pendulating Papacy, where Bishop Sanborn says he recalled a conversation that he had with Archbishop Lefebvre and asked him, well, Your Excellency, why was it seemingly that as soon as the death of Pius XII, we immediately had John the 23rd, we immediately had this entire machine that was ready to go in action? How was that possible? And Bishop Sanborn said that Archbishop Lefebvre responded back, and he said, well, they were all there. I mean, these were Pius XII's men. I mean, you have to lay that at his feet. I mean, being fair, these were his men.
Yes, indeed. With few exceptions. When you read the book, for instance, The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, which I was actually recommended to someone today by this Father Ralph Wiltgen. These were Pius XII's men. The bad guys in Europe that he just left in positions, not really wanting to crack heads. Pius X was a head cracker. No, that's the difference. When people would tell me too about, JP2, our beloved Holy Father, he doesn't take any action with these different priests because he feels that he can. I mean, if you look at Pius X, he cracked heads. He removed people. He instituted oaths. He fired the whole faculty of Dunwoody Seminary, the Archdiocesan Seminary in New York, by telegraph. And he,
I've heard the story. It's good.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely terrific. I mean, and because the Dunwoody in the early 1900s, they had a publication that was modernist, sympathetic to, and they had the seminarians, believe it or not, going to lectures from a Protestant minister down at some divinity school. So there's no question about letting that go. So he fired everyone by telegram. When he had the Archbishop of New York in for an ad limina visit, he screamed at him, and the guy came out with his cape all askew, and he installed as rector of the seminary to replace the modernist, the former chaplain to the New York City Police Department. I guess just so people would get the message. And this was before, Twitter and Facebook, So the thing is that when you hear something about one of the modernists like J.P. Tour, you heard about Pius XII, you say that these people could have really cracked heads if they'd wanted to.
Certainly.
Okay. Well, for those of you,
yeah. So for those of you who are just joining us, it's about 20 after the top of the hour, and we're trying to wind down Chapter 2 here. You're listening to the Work of Human Hands on the Restoration Radio Network with Father Anthony Cekada, who is giving us a much deeper and more personal insight into his book. Father, I think there's no way that we can close out Chapter 2 without discussing two names here real quick. We don't have to go into a very long discussion about this, but Louis Boyer and Joseph Jungmann, who were both very, very much foundational, instrumental modernists who were dead set on changing the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. And you mentioned two main theories of Joseph Jungmann. You might briefly just explain who he was, and then the two theories he espoused, the corruption theory and the pastoral liturgy theory. And pastoral being a buzzword that we all hear all the time. I mean, going back to the Novus Ordo, I used to hear pastoral constantly. That was supposedly the framework to which I was to understand, the Catholic Church. So, and that all originated essentially at one point. Can you kind of go into Jungmann and Boyer a little bit?
Yes, Jungmann was an Austrian Jesuit and scholar of the sacred liturgy, and he wrote a book when he was a convent chaplain during the Second World War called The Mass of the Roman Rite, a 2-volume work, and a lot of scholarship went into it, consulted a lot of original sources and so on. He had written many articles for the liturgical movement, for liturgical movement publications. He was tremendously influential. He was even admired, both he and Boyer were even admired by post-Vatican II conservatives, very, very much for their work. So they had this aura, this reputation. But in the case of Jungmann, he had what comes through in his writings, and I show this in the book, is what's called the corruption theory, that basically he believed that after the primitive ages, the church's liturgy became corrupt. in response to having to drive off different heresies like Arianism, that the popular participation stopped. This was a really bad thing. There was a barrier between God and the people, that worship became sort of privatized. And so basically everything went downhill from the 6th century in the Catholic liturgy. It was corrupt. And so that was one idea. And when you read this, if you're familiar with how the liturgy goes in the liturgical developments after Vatican II, you can see that his argument all the time is against the traditional liturgy. So that comes out. I remember noticing that when I was preparing a course to teach at the seminary my first year as a priest. And it had the same, even though it was pre-Vatican II, it had the same aura that writers after Vatican II would have. So that's his corruption theory, where the traditional liturgy was corrupt. The other idea is his pastoral liturgy theory, that he had this idea that in primitive ages, everything was accommodated to the pastoral needs of the people, so that you have to make liturgy comprehensible, and you have to draw the people in, that this is the true form of participation. The liturgy is supposed to form people almost like a classroom. And then, of course, well, how can you do that if it's in Latin? And so he talked about Latin as this veil that covers the sacred liturgy that prevents people from getting involved. So he's tremendously influential. That the pastoral idea is that, well, everything has to be accommodated to the people, the lowest common denominator. And the corruption that the traditional theory is, the traditional liturgy is somehow bad and corrupt. So that's Jungmann. The other one is Louis Bouillet, and he's was a convert from Protestantism, a Frenchman. He wrote a book called Liturgical Piety, and actually it was a series of lectures that he gave at Notre Dame, Indiana in 1954. And he had just about nothing with the sacred liturgy as it stood was right with him. He condemned the medieval period. He condemned the Baroque period, the Counter-Reformation period. He condemned the time of Granger. He had the idea that what liturgy should do is de-emphasize the idea of sacrifice and de-emphasize the idea of the real presence of Christ in the Mass, and emphasize instead the idea of the assembled people, the Jewish idea of the Kahal Yahweh, the assembled people of God. And so he was a particularly bitter critic of the traditional liturgy. Even in 1954, he hated Thomism, and the traditional theological system, as it were, of the Catholic Church. So both of these guys, their ideas had a tremendous influence on the new Mass. Jungmann was part of the commission in the 1960s that actually put together the new Mass, as was Louis Bouillet. And the between them, they wielded an enormous influence on the development of the new rite. They were a influence on Paul VI and Montini before the Second Vatican Council. He quoted them very favorably when he was Archbishop of Milan, and these were the people that he brought in when they wanted to dynamite the Mass. So that's the two big characters are Jungmann and Bouillet.
Father, you mentioned Thomism and what may also be referred to as neo-scholasticism. What is it that the modernists cannot stand about St. Thomas Aquinas?
It's clear. It defines. You get propositions. The theological language is things can be summed up very, very succinctly and very clearly, and that's what good theology is supposed to do. And the neo-scholasticism or Thomism is is excellent at that. That they give you a proposition at the beginning of what they're going to prove. They define all the terms. They show all the proofs for the arguments and so on, and you can follow it rationally. But the modernists don't like that because it's clear. And it shows Catholic doctrine very, very clearly. It tells you what, tells you sort of where everything is supposed to be situated. Because the modernists believe in a evolution of doctrine and believe instead that dogmas sort of arise from within and within different people and sort of coalesce, and that's how you get dogma rather than coming from without, coming from divine revelation. So they don't like things too clear. Mm-hmm. So they hate it.
Yeah. There's one thing about Annibale Bugnini that I think really jumped out at me whenever I was reading this chapter was that if you read much of his writings, it's almost like reading a preface to the document Sacrosanctum Concilium of Vatican II. I mean, this the need for the restoration of rights, the return to the primitive church. This was almost the foundational text there. You can see it all throughout that document. I mean, obviously they were thoroughly imbibing in the modernist theology that he was espousing. So one last point that I'd like to bring up, and we can't get around this because we talked about Montini, and this comes towards the close of chapter 2 where you quoted one of the things he said was that he had the belief that the, quote, church must transform the difficulties posed by her liturgical rites, unquote. Now, certainly that kind of harkens right back to Bugnini. And I think this is the key to understanding the underpinnings of the creation of the Novus Ordo. Why? What difficulties was Montini veiling in that 1958 pastoral letter? What were the difficulties, Father?
Well, the idea there was that you had the Mass in Latin, and that impeded instruction because you have an idea of the Mass as an instruction session. So that has to go. The rites are complicated. Rites are complicated and mystical. These are hard to explain to people. So everything has to be simplified and watered down and brought down to a lower level. Thirdly, you could say that many of the rites seem arcane and alien to so-called modern man and modern secular society. So these have to be downgraded. So there was a whole array of different things that he saw as problematic.
Okay. Well, Father, I think this is a good place to close chapter 2, and I'm going to give you just a brief minute here for you to express your thoughts on chapter 2 and what you want the listener to understand. Certainly, the title of the second chapter being the change agents and the definition of liturgical movement. I think this illustrates that all of these men who you outline and you identified, they were devout disciples of the modernism condemned by St. Pius X just 50 years prior. That's really what struck me. And I'd like just for you to go ahead and put an end to chapter 2 here for our listener and what you would like them to take home.
Well, I would say this. The inclination when you hear a statement like that from someone like me, okay, the evil Father Cekada, is that this is something that is exaggerated, okay? That we're these hard-headed trends are just sort of making this up now and trying to put a label on it. But in point of fact, if you look at the sources before Vatican II, here's what you find in the on the theological plane. There is a group theologians called La Nouvelle Théologie, the new theology. And they were the prime movers of so much at Vatican II, at the Second Vatican Council. Yves Congar, Schillebeeck, Karl Rahner. There's a whole load of them that were extremely influential in Vatican II. They were suspects before Vatican II, and now the scholars, mainline scholars, refer to these people as the inheritors of modernism and as the precursors to the Second Vatican Council. So now in mainstream theological writing, there seemed to be very clearly a connection between the modernists and the classical modernists of the time of Pius X and the theologians of Vatican II. So that's an accepted idea in an analysis generally of the men who had theological influence at Vatican II. Specifically on the question of sacred liturgy, don't just take my word for it that it was a question of a modernist influence in the liturgical movement as a lead up to the Second Vatican Council. I quote one author in my book, a man named Ernest Conacher, who is a Lutheran and who wrote a very interesting book on the liturgical movement, Catholic liturgical movement from a Lutheran perspective. And he thought that the liturgical movement was just absolutely great, what was being accomplished. And he said in 54 or 55 that the liturgical movement as it stood then were truly the inheritors of modernism, that they were the ones who had taken up the flag for the modernist cause, what was considered heresy under Pius X, and brought it forward into the 1950s and would bring it into the future. So there's very clearly a connection on both levels, of the level of theology in general and the liturgical movement in particular. So that explains a lot. That explains a lot. The new Mass and the changes in the liturgy did not come out of nowhere. They came out of modernism.
Well, I think that's a great way to end, Father, and I would encourage our listeners to go pick up a copy of this book and follow along as we continue on this season. You can pick up a copy of that book, Work of Human Hands, at sggresources.org. And if you want to contact Father Cekada, his mailing address is St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church, 4900 Rialto Road, that's Rialto, Westchester, Ohio, 45069. If you have any questions you'd like to pass on to Father Cekada via email, you can mail us at humanhands@truerestoration.org. And I might also put a plug in here for Father's ministry. They're always in need of donations, and we would like to encourage our listeners to be generous with their apostolate. They spend a lot of time with us on the air. We don't take this for granted. Father is always very willing to come on and be a real trooper here to field a lot of questions and talk about a wide variety of topics. He'll be on next Thursday night with Bishop Sanborn for Francis Watch, which will be, I'm sure, a big marathon show since we haven't done a show with Francis since October. So Father is giving a lot of his time to you, and so we would ask that you would please consider making a donation. So Father, thank you so very much for your time here this evening, and we'll be back on the air with you next month on February the 20th.
Thanks very much. God bless you all.
All right. God bless. Bye-bye.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org.